Welcome to Face to Face. This is a show about change and about what's next. It's a show that wants to ask questions, peel back the layers of our average everyday experience, and go beyond scratching the surface. We interview amazing people with incredible ideas and stories who have done wild, weird, and wonderful things. Remember that imagination shared creates collaboration, and collaboration creates community, and community inspires social change. I'm David Peck, and this is Face to Face. So today's podcast is with Kelly Ernst. He's from the Strategic Intelligence Alliance. He's a consultant who works in fund development, monitoring and evaluation, strategic development, but he's also now the Secretary General for the Basic Income Network for Canada, which is basically about getting people a basic income. I mean, it's as simple as that. It's about reducing poverty. It's about eradicating poverty here in Canada. And listen in today as Kelly talks about why this is so important and why he thinks it's actually very affordable. It's an interesting and intelligent interview with a guy who cares a great deal about poverty here in Canada. And please don't forget to check out my site, davidpecklive.com. Real Change is Incremental is now available on amazon.ca. And we'll see you next week. Well, welcome to Face, and we've got a nice sunny day here, well, sort of sunny day here in Toronto, and I'm joined by Kelly Ernst, our guest from Basic Income Canada. Thanks for joining us today, Kelly.
Thank you for having me.
It's been a little while coming getting this sorted out, so I apologize for that, but Kelly is the Secretary General for the Basic Income Canada Network. Kelly, it sounds pretty impressive, your title. Can you tell me a little bit more about what that means for you and what you're doing for the Basic Income Network? And maybe, you know what, if you want to wrap up in that answer, why don't you talk a little bit about what the heck basic income really is? We have had Rob Rayner on before, and he's talked about this a little bit in the past, but a refresher wouldn't hurt.
Okay. Well, our organization is devoted to getting the public to have a thirst for a guaranteed annual income. So the whole idea behind a basic income or a guaranteed annual income is that all Canadians would be guaranteed never to go below a floor of income that would pay for your living expenses such as rent, food, clothing, and other basics. Right. So a lot of people call that floor level, a low-income cutoff, or a market basket measure. There's lots of different names and ways to identify that floor. But the whole idea is to pay for the necessities of life so that you can pursue the things that you want to do in life without the worry of where's your next meal coming from, or am I going to pay my rent?
So in a way, it's kind of providing a certain amount of infrastructure for families or individuals to get to the things that are going to help them move forward in their life, whether it's education or childcare or starting their own business, that kind of thing?
Yes, exactly. The idea behind it is, as well as you look into it more deeply, is very often people say, oh, well, you just want to give everybody a welfare check. And actually, no, we don't. What we'd like to do is completely reform that whole system so that governments are not gatekeepers of people's income, but rather that governments, in a proactive way, ensure that nobody ever falls below a floor of income. That doesn't mean that we would do it in such a way that we would put barriers in front of people to pursue work, go find education, start a business, and so on and so forth. And in fact, the studies that I've seen on this say that a basic income would help in all of those areas.
So, Kelly, help me and I guess the listeners understand, how is basic income not just welfare?
Well, welfare is the way it's set up now in Canada. You have 13 different jurisdictions handing out income security checks in a number of different programs within their jurisdictions, but you have to meet qualifications to get it. So the idea is, well, we'll give you a little bit of money. It's not enough to fully live on, but we're going to put you through all of these qualifications to make sure that you meet the qualifications so that, we dole out as little as possible.
So basically, welfare sort of has these, it's almost like tied aid in a sense.
Yeah, well, a lot of people call it the welfare trap.
Yeah,
so, you get people into that system, they've qualified to be in the system, but now the only way that they can obtain any income is if they meet all of these criteria and continue to meet those criteria. And if they start falling outside of it, you start taking away their income. And so what it does is it motivates people to never get out of that system. So what we would like to do is totally reform the whole way of looking at this and say in a totally different way, let's proactively ensure, rather than act as a gatekeeper, ensure that everybody in Canada never goes below a floor of income so that they can pay for the necessities of life. And that is a totally different way of looking at the world. And I guess if you think of it that way, there's different ways of doing it. So there's different mechanisms for that. One of them is called a negative income tax. So what that would allow people to do is they go off and they work or pursue income in whatever means they can get, and if their income is below a certain threshold, they would get a tax refund to top them up to ensure that they don't go below that threshold. Now, in a negative income tax scenario, if you were earning, say, $100,000 a year, huge amounts of money, even beyond that, of course, you wouldn't qualify for basic income.
Right.
But you have the equivalent and far beyond, so, why do you need it? So another method is it's called the Demogrant method, where every Canadian gets a grant. And so that grant is the same for every single person. Everybody gets it. And then when you put in your taxes at the end of the year, you might get some of that tax back,
right.
Or if you're earning a huge amount of money, you get all of it taxed back.
Right.
So in the same way, the end result might be actually pretty similar, but the method to deliver it is just very different. In Alaska, in the United States, is one state that actually has a Demogrant, and it's based on income from royalties that they give out to their population. So in Alaska, as long as you stay out of jail and you're a citizen of Alaska, you can get this guaranteed annual income every year. Now, it's small. It's I think at most it's ever been is about $2,000 per person. But if you think of that on a basis of a family, so say a family of 5, that's $10,000 a year that goes to your family. And then that becomes substantial amounts of money that really helps to ensure that you're not, falling below a floor and that you can pay for your rent and so on and so forth. The interesting thing about Alaska is they have, in the United States, one of the lowest poverty levels in the U.S. and the highest levels of employment as well. So it's fairly clear from using that model that it doesn't erode people's, motivation to go to work.
Right. Yeah, because I would imagine that's a pretty kind of an immediate criticism. I'm pretty sure I brought this up with Rob. I do a lot of work in international development and overseas and so on, and I know that one of the criticisms from, the sort of the more fiscally conservative folk, I suppose, who want to talk about individualism and the ability to raise ourselves out of poverty and floating all boats and so on.
Yeah.
They'll say, well, people in the developing world, they're afraid to work, or they're lazy, or and quite the contrary.
There's actually a really interesting study going on in India at the moment in a basic income trial. So in India, there's a trial going on using a basic income in a few towns, and they found exactly the opposite.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
the data is actually showing that
I
what a
believe it.
basic income is doing, yes, it's helping to pay for their food and clothing, but people are pooling money together and actually creating businesses and opportunities for themselves, or they're buying equipment for themselves and starting their own businesses. It's motivating people to actually pursue their dreams.
I recently interviewed Nigel Fisher, and he ran UNICEF for years. He was the assistant secretary general in Haiti and Syria and Rwanda. I mean, he's been around, and he
Yeah.
said after, I don't know, 38 years of working in humanitarian affairs, two things that are consistent across the board when you speak to people around the world. One, we want jobs. We need opportunities to get work, fair work, interesting work, and two, we want to educate our children. That
Yeah.
doesn't sound like people we want a good education for our children. And
Yeah.
that doesn't sound like lazy folk to me. And when I travel, what I see are all these little businesses and people just trying to make a go of it in whatever way they can, with whatever resources they have. And like you say, I mean, it's completely the opposite of what you might sort of that cliche that you might fall into.
Yeah, it's a huge stereotype that needs to be
Huge.
broken.
Yeah.
Yeah, and really, there's no basis for that stereotype. You can even look in Canada. You don't have to go internationally to understand how motivated people are to pursue things in their lives. 88% to 90% of Canadians already earn above the threshold of what might be a basic income. And they continue to work. Even when
That's a great
they're
point.
making millions of dollars, people are continued to motivated to work.
Yeah.
So it really their argument really falls apart when you start looking at people making money. And when people start making a little bit, they actually become more motivated.
Well, and the fact is, I mean, the reality is people are always going to look for ways of scamming the system, and no matter who they are, no matter what culture you live in, that's just going to happen, right?
Yeah.
There's the flim-flam men and women exist all over the world. But that's not a reason for not doing something that actually is going to enhance the greater good.
No, and the other thing about the scammers of the world, I think that's a totally different issue.
Huh.
So basic income and income support and the scammers of the world, they're totally different. So we have seen in the last 5 years scammers at the millionaire level. So all we need to do is go back to the economic downturn and look at the scammers that have been charged. Some of them are now in jail. Those weren't poor people. Those were rich people. So it existed at every level. And so there needs to be a level of accountability on the populace on every level, and not just focused in on, it's the poor that are scammers.
Right.
Because that just isn't the case.
Well, and
scammers everywhere.
Well, it's an interesting thought, and I wonder if we could explore this a bit. Tell me if it's even worth talking about. But I've never really considered the notion that, I mean, the free market, this whole idea of individualism, this whole idea of self creation and empowerment and so on, isn't that based on the notion that we all have it within us? We all have this ability, right? So why
we all have this? They all have this ability. There's an old book that, if people are interested in this idea, it's called Man's Search for Meaning.
Right, Viktor Frankl.
Yeah, Viktor Frankl. And when you read that book, you start understanding the psychological aspect of everybody wanting to have meaning in their life and pursue opportunity, even in the most horrendous and difficult circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And all people, it's ingrained within us. It's in our brains, it's in our genes to want to have meaning in our lives. And so it doesn't really matter how much money you have or you don't have. You're going to want to pursue that. And I think you alluded to that when you said when you go to really poor places, you see that all over the place.
So you see quite the opposite. Well, I've often wondered if it's like us, either it's appealing to our ability to go inward, so we can just say and therefore not give to others because they're just lazy anyway, right? After all, or is it just some kind of implicit, tacit kind of racism actually on some level, right? because well, they're over there and we can't really see them, but boy, they're lazy. I mean, that's a massive oversimplification and a sweeping
Well,
generalization.
I don't think it actually is an oversimplification. I think the latter is very true. Is, you know, we're often fearful of the other.
Right.
So if we don't know the other, that we ascribe things to the other that are negative, and you know that supports us in
And it
some
supports,
way.
buoys our spirits, right?
But it also provides us a sense of protection.
Right.
You know that we're not going to be like that.
That's right.
And so sometimes we have to counter that, and racism is a really good example of that. We have to counter that sometimes. We have to remind ourselves from time to time that, I've come across a cultural difference that's different, that isn't better or worse. And in the same way with poor people, I think we have to understand that very often poor people are more similar to everyone else in society than they are different. And so we have to remind ourselves that this lazy stereotype is just that. It's a stereotype that we need to counter, and it's very, very probable when, we come in front of a person who is poor or very poor, that they have aspirations in life, that they want to pursue that. And when you're not allowed to pursue that or you can't do that, very often you get mental health issues associated with that as well. And that's the root of very many mental health issues in some of these populations. The Aboriginal communities talk about this an awful lot in terms of, the change in their cultures have really stripped the meaning from their life. And as a result, you see some of the communities having problems with alcoholism and mental health issues, and suicide, and so on and so forth, because they feel their meaning of life being totally eroded. So these problems are very, very real. So allowing people to pursue meaning in their life, I think, is a very, very good thing.
Do you know what?
Supporting that with the basic income is a good thing.
It makes me wonder sometimes, we talk about a level playing field, but it seems to me that on a lot of levels, from a human perspective anyway, the playing field is already level. It's just we don't see that too often, and it's our own pride and arrogance and sense of nationalism and all these things that get in the way of that. We're all in this together, right? Aren't we? I mean, your comment about poor people are very similar to everyone. We're all just trying to get a good night's sleep, aren't we, Kelly? Really?
Yeah, yes and no. We're all in this together. We are living all in one world, and we're all one humanity. But there is this thing called the lottery of birth. So where you are born and who you are born with really makes a big difference in the world as to whether or not you can feed yourself. So if you are in a lottery of birth and you're in a slum in a developing country, that is very different than your lottery of birth in the east side of New York and in a very wealthy home. I mean, I can't underline that more. And some of our policies in our country that reinforce that, I'm quite alarmed about and worried about. And those are things like the erosion of public education.
Right.
We know that one of the things that helps people get out of that poverty cycle is to ensure that they have really good education. So when we move toward an increasingly private education system where people have huge tuition or huge loans at the end of it, where we ensure that only people with money can get a good education, that really reinforces that whole cycle of poverty in families.
Kelly,
so it's things like that
sure.
Policies can be different. So.
Well, and I think it's an indication too how policies can be different, but can also make a difference.
Yeah,
it's not just some sort of bureaucratic tweak.
No, it isn't a bureaucratic tweak. It actually has impact on people's lives in an awfully big way. So, education is one thing. How much income you give people is another piece of that. So, one good thing that Canada has is a universal healthcare system, and we all understand now in Canada that there's no indignity from us using the public health service. And in fact, if we go to emergency, there's nothing undignified about going to use a public hospital. And in the same way, what we're arguing is there should be no indignity for us to receive a basic income to ensure that we have the necessities of life. And if we all knew that we had universal access to that particular program and that we could use it when we need it in a proactive way, I think that would move our society along quite substantially. So we know that we can eliminate poverty in this manner, and we know that we can afford it. The studies that I have done on this issue are fairly clear with respect to the economic data. We can afford to do this.
Kelly, just before we go into that, because I really do want to pursue that a little bit about this whole, how the heck can we afford something like this? It sounds awfully expensive. Can you tell me, from your perspective, the work you've done over the years, and academically and research and volunteer work and so on, your consulting work? By the way, Kelly has a company called Strategical Intelligence Alliance. And spends his spare time helping organizations strategically fund development and monitoring and evaluation and so on. Check him out. He's on LinkedIn online. How would you define poverty? Or, you use the phrase poor people. Are we talking just about a financial distinction here, Kelly, or is it a little more comprehensive than that in your mind?
I think a lot of people go beyond that, and go beyond income, and start talking about other things. That you might be socially poor, or
right.
So your social network is small and that type of thing. I actually think that confuses the whole issue, and it actually brings in other variables that are indicators of other things. So, for example, if you are you have a terribly small network, that might be not an indicator of poverty, but an indicator of mental health issues, for example. Or it may be an indicator of physical issues, or it may be a whole host of other things. I think it's better to leave poverty and define it on an economic basis. And then once you do that, and then you solve the issue of poverty, then you can clearly identify what those other variables and issues are. So once you move it out of the way, then you go, oh, this person can't keep a job because of these reasons. So now we can focus on these reasons as well. But but right now we're mixing everything together. And it really gets our mind off of what is the issue about ensuring this person.
Well, in a sense, you're almost saying. You're saying something to the effect of how the heck can we talk about sending a young boy or girl to school anywhere in the world if they're dying of dysentery? You've got to deal with the very basic levels first before you get to the, like you, as you said, the other variables.
Yeah, you have to. You have to deal with that. So I get really upset with, for example, poverty reduction models and strategies that strip out income, and they move into dealing with all the symptoms of poverty and mental illnesses and health issues, and giving all of these social services to people and so on and so forth. Nothing wrong in all of that, but it isn't a poverty reduction model. And if that worked, this 9% floor of poverty that we seem to have had in the last 30 years in Canada, poverty we would have cured, but it hasn't worked, and we have not been able to cure that 9%. You mentioned my consulting practice. One of the things I'm really interested in are outcome research or impact research, and if you actually look at impact research and outcome research on a macro level in Canada on poverty, we have been a dismal failure in the last 30 years. We have not really attacked it. And I believe the reason that we have not attacked it is because we've defocused our mind away from tackling the core issue, and the core issue is income. So if we tackled income, a lot of these problems would go away, and you would actually see that people's lives would actually change in a really substantive way. There are two places in Canada where we have made an impact with income, and one is called the guaranteed income supplement that seniors receive. A lot of people argue it's not enough, but if you look at the data, what it did for seniors was it actually got a huge cohort of seniors out of poverty. So it really changed people's lives. And in fact, it's looked internationally as a model. Canada's looked at a model for this particular program to say how can we do this in other programs or other countries to eliminate poverty. In that same way, we need to pay attention to that data, because that data actually shows that income actually has a substantive impact on people's lives. So if we have a basic income for the rest of Canadians, you would see poverty be eliminated in Canada, and it wouldn't eliminate all the problems that Canada has, social and health and other problems, but what it would allow us to do is then direct our attention to those issues specifically to solve those particular issues. But I don't think it's wise to mush them all together and ignore income because we're fearful it might cost too much money.
So let's start with that assumption that income, basic income is the core issue, and it sounds right to me. Tell me how we're going to afford it now.
Well, first of all, I think we can afford it. So there's a number of different ways that we can do it. Let me tell you the fear first, and then I'll go to the
please.
solution.
Yeah, good.
Okay.
Good.
So the fear first, and this is where people make the assumption that we're just going to give a grant to everybody for, say, $20,000, and it's going to cost the 35 million Canadians, the $700 billion to put into place. And that's where people go, well, we can't possibly afford this. That isn't the idea. I understand that we economically can't afford that. So that's 3 times our federal budget, and I just can't see it. However, if you look at it differently, if you look at the idea that 88 to 90% of people already have the equivalent of a basic income or living in a household with that equivalent, so they don't have to worry. So now we're only talking about sort of the bottom end. Okay?
Right.
So that reduces the amount that you have to top people's income up substantially. Now, there's questions as to how to do that and who to give the money to and so on and so forth.
Right.
One of the ways to do that might be if you did it through the tax system, as Hugh Siegel has suggested. The people that file taxes would get a refund up to a minimum level, okay? We know that 1.75 million Canadians filed taxes in 2012 below $20,000. So if you took those 1.75 million Canadians and you topped them up to that minimum $18,000 to $20,000 per person, what we know is it would cost as little as $11 billion and maybe as much as $14 billion for that particular group of people. That within affordability of our budget, if we look at the priorities of our spending and so on and so forth. All of us can probably identify other programs in the past 10 years that have been far beyond $11 billion. And in fact, we're now moving into surplus territory in our federal government, where by 2020, some of the projections of the federal government are the surplus is going to be $10 to $15 billion. That's more than paying for the amount that we need to get everyone in Canada out of poverty. So that's why I'm saying if you look at the data and you look at it differently and
Yeah.
you use different criteria to actually make sure that everybody has, universal access to a basic income, and not just willy-nilly, go off and use stereotypes, that it actually is very affordable.
Well, and I think, it seems to me that people are going to right out of the gate, 11 to 14 billion dollars. Are you crazy? Like where do you? I mean, we're talking about money that most of us can't even begin to imagine. But it seems to me that your idea of looking at it from a different perspective, from coming at it from a different angle. I mean, what about all the related costs to poverty, to the fact that 1.75 million Canadians are making below $20,000 a year? What about the health implications? What
Well,
about
if your audience can't get your mind around $11 billion, here's another figure that you're really going to have problems with. So the cost of maintaining people in poverty for health costs, security costs, for maintaining poor in jails, and so on and so forth, that cost in some estimates is $90 to $100 billion annually.
Wow, and that's just in Canada?
If in Canada alone. So that's federal and provincial costs, and we pay for that every single year. So if you even reduce that by 10%, you're now paying for that basic.
You're paying for the basic income. It's fabulous. I love it. So why the heck then is it so hard to convince people depending on what side of the fence you're on, to say, can you not come over here and just peel back a layer or two and see this in a little bit of a different way?
Because people are talking about stereotypes all the time, and they're not talking about actual data. So they're not actually looking for the evidence. They're not actually examining the evidence. And they're talking, about their ideologies, or they're talking about their what they think the poor might be, and so on and so forth. And that's kind of the challenge. Is what I would encourage people to do is talk about it in an evidence kind of based way, and you'll see that actually it makes a lot of sense. And former Senator Hugh Segal, has been a real champion in pushing it in that manner. Another senator that's been doing that is Art Eggleton. And both of them, pay attention when they speak about this issue, because I know that they have done their homework. They have gone back to, look at various pieces of evidence and ensure that they're saying nothing that they can't substantiate. This for them isn't ideology.
Do you find that the thing that just sort of bubbled to the surface here for me was, so now we're talking about numbers.
Yeah.
And yes, and one of the really revealing things for me as a development worker years ago, when I was learning results-based management principles and language and how to write a log frame and so on, very dull, stultifying work. But for me, I had a revelation on the drive home from a class 12, 13 years ago, and I said, holy cow, this one that we're working on, there's 383 boys and girls at the end of this project that are going to actually get an education if this works. Think of the implications of the families and the lives that are going to be impacted. It was $173,000 proposal going to CETA, which is now DFAT-D in Canada. But it was up until that point, I was angry about this work that I was doing. Right? Oh, these are numbers, these are boxes. But once I had that relational connection, these are real human beings. Is there a danger that when you start talking about numbers like this, oh, folks, it's only going to cost us 11 to 14, but that we push out that narrative side of the story behind basic income? Because I think that's kind of one of the strengths of it. But at the same time, in order to get the more conservative fiscal folk on board, you do have to talk about numbers. So I guess you got a bit of a challenge there, don't you?
It's a real challenge, because you're right. The fiscal conservative. That's all I want to hear is tell me.
Bottom line, Kelly. Give me the bottom line, right?
Tell me how much this is going to cost and where you're going to get the money from.
That's right. That's right. Show me the flow chart. Yeah.
Exactly. And so we have to do that. And I have to be articulate in that.
Yeah.
So hope I have been to a certain degree today. On the other side of the spectrum, you have the people that they couldn't care less about
That's
numbers
right.
and they don't understand them, but they want to hear that story, and so you have to have both. And yes, there's lots and lots of stories that I can tell, and other people can do it far better than me. But you have to understand that the impact that a program like this will have is on both ends. So it is impactful in reducing that cost of poverty, but it's also impactful for that child in the school who used to go there without a breakfast, who now can go there with a breakfast and pay attention all day because he's not worried about his or her stomach grumbling, and can concentrate. I mean, there's both ends of that, right? But I think the public needs to understand that there's not a dotted line, but a solid straight line between that child and that school and that policy of giving people a basic income.
Right.
So the two are, yes, very different, but they're really, really connected.
Very connected. We got to wrap up in a few minutes here, but before we do that, I'd like to lean on a little bit of your consulting experience and some of the work that you've done over the years. You talk about impact measurement and so on, and there seems to be more of a trend towards donors saying, hey, we want results. We don't want to just know about, how many wells we drilled or how much food we gave away, but we want to know about impact. What's that actually meaning at the, at the end of the 3-year project or the 1 year or whatever the case might be? So I guess my question to you is, are we making a difference? Are we actually having a greater impact today than we were 5, 10, 15, or 20 years ago? In other words, are there more reasons to get involved, Kelly?
Yes, I guess the way I would answer that is, where are we having an impact? By what method and when? So, I mean, you got to really dig into it.
Sure.
So you can't really carte blanche say, are we having an impact? I think, too, we have to recognize that in some areas we're not.
Right.
And that tells us an awful lot of information as well. And we need to be not just seeking out the information that's so good, but we also need to be courageous enough to say, where are we not having an impact?
Right.
So, and poverty is one area where we're really not having an impact in Canada, for example, in a substantive way. And we need to pay attention to that. And if we don't, it's to our peril. And there's a lot of international kind of things going on that people have scratched their head and said, I guess we're not having an impact with the way that we're doing it now. We need to do it in a different way. And that is where, microloans came from in a large degree, is, people were understanding that, throwing money at government didn't really have the impact that they wanted to see, but giving people money in terms of microloans had a far, far greater impact on people's lives. And so, of course, the microloan movement really, really took off when you learned that. I point to, areas of rule of law and corruption as well. I mean, in one of my previous positions, we studied this and looked at people's writings about the rule of law. So, a lot of international development aid has gone to ensuring that, democratic ideals are instilled in countries, and the institutions of the countries are being adopted that are, associated with what we would call democracy.
Right.
And a lot of people have scratched their head and said, "Ooh, we've really been a failure at this.
Right.
It's not worked out well. It's done things like caused wars and created horrible results in some scenarios, or just created a lot of corruption." So I mean, these are examples where pay attention to what works, but pay attention to what doesn't work too, and assess both. And don't be afraid to receive data from both, because I think if you're afraid to receive the data from both, we can't improve. we can't know what's working really, really well. So, I mean, that's part of the reason that
It's almost, approach what we do with a bit of humility. Yeah, yes, we might be able to get things sorted out here in a particular way, but you know what? There are lessons to be learned, and let's not be afraid of them. I mean, it seems that so many folks involved in this type of work are afraid of those mistakes or are afraid of those, I guess you could almost say negative lessons learned, because it could affect their funding ultimately. And so it's almost like we have to re-educate donors as well. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I believe we do. And part of the reason I'm enjoying being involved with the Basic Income Canada Network is, I can follow up on research and say, we know that giving money to people actually works.
Right.
So let's do this.
Yeah, right.
And throwing money at a broad range of services to try to address people's symptoms around poverty very often doesn't work.
Right.
And so, let's get honest and real about the idea. If you want to actually eliminate poverty, let's talk about income, and let's get honest about income. Let's not get sidetracked by always going to the service model where we're going to gatekeep services and little pockets of income to people to try to push them along. Let's actually get honest about what people need.
Kelly, thanks for taking the time to talk about this very important issue. Kelly is the Secretary General, or maybe the Acting Executive Director of the Basic Income Network. That's biencanada.ca, BIEN Canada.ca. Basic Income Network provides information on basic income, promotes the idea, and educates the public and policymakers about ways to support a basic income. Check out their website, sign up for their newsletter. There are ways to get involved and stay actively up to date on current affairs. I'm going to end with a quote from an article that Kelly and a guy by the name of Rob Rayner wrote for the Toronto Star a few months back. Quote, Canadians must ask which politicians have the courage to eliminate the cost of poverty by implementing a universal basic income guarantee, not ditching good ideas before examining them with solid evidence. Close quote. Our guest today has been Kelly Ernst from Basic Income Canada. Thanks again, Kelly.
Thank you so much.